Dorothee Bohle. I'm the director of the postdoctoral Max Weber program at the EUY. And this is, as I said, it's the first book roundtable. And the idea here is that the criteria for having a roundtable on a book is that it should be an important recent book in the social sciences that tackles major topic of our times and is able to appeal to a broad and multidisciplinary audience. So we want specifically have social science that is broad and not overly specialized and that has something to say about the period we are living in. And I could not imagine a more fitting book than Grounded Nationalisms, a Sociological Analysis by Siniša Malešević to start the series. It tackles a big question, that of the continuing existence and ever-increasing relevance of nationalism. It does through a historical and macro-sociological lens, and it is thought-provoking, especially for those of us who would like to be more than happy to see nationalism finally disappear as an influential ideology and practice, rather than seeing it ever more grounded, as Siniša claims in his book. So let me take the opportunity to briefly introduce also not the book, that's not my task, but the guest of today. And although I'm really sorry that he cannot be here in person, I'm still happy that we could put this together. So Siniša Malešević holds a chair in sociology at the University College Dublin. He also held research and teaching appointments at the Institute for International Relations in Zagreb, the Center of the Study of Nationalism at CEU when it was still in Prague. And there he worked with the late Ernest Gellner. And he also held a position at the National University of Ireland, Galway. And he is a prolific scholar. So Grounded Nationalism is just one of the many books that he has written in the recent decades. And they all, so I will not go through all of them, but they all deal with really important topics of organized violence, nation-state nationalism, war and violence, ideology, but also ethnicity, but also he has a number of books on sociological theory itself. So in short, he writes on the reason why we selected this book, or why I selected this book for the first book, is that he really writes on a major topic of our time, or topics of our time: war, violence, nationalism, and he does so from a historical sociology and sociological theory perspective. And I'm very pleased to welcome him. Welcome, Siniša. Let me also briefly introduce the panelists to you, so those who will be critically assessing the book and my claims that it is such an important and great book. So this is Veronica Anghel, who is a Max Weber Fellow at the EUY. She's a political scientist. She works on democratization and informal institutions and how they shape or misshape democracies, especially in East Central Europe. Then the second the book discussants is Jelena Dzankic, who is a part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center, who works on issues of citizenship, migration, Europeanization, and state building. Then we have Benjamin Goossen, who is a Max Weber Fellow at the EUY, who is a historian. He works on modern nationalism and the global environment. And we have Hanspeter Kriesi, who is a professor at the political science at the RSCAS department, working on comparative politics, political sociology, social movements, and political behavior. I think Hanspeter is as broad as Siniša, and I'm really looking forward to, these broad conversations that we are going to have. The format, very briefly, is as follows. Everyone has up to 10 minutes, not more. So we start with an opening statement by Siniša Malešević, and then each respondent has up to 10 minutes to make their main points. We will have a short rejoinder before opening to the public. It is only when you talk, I mean, apart from the panelists, when you talk that we ask you to show your video. But otherwise, and I see that I think people really comply with this in order to, because we also filmed this event, we would like to see the panelists on the video and not lots of people there where one cannot really any longer recognize who is who. All in all, we will have maximum 1.5 hours for the event. And with this, I give the floor to Siniša. Welcome again.
Okay, thanks very much, Dora, for your kind words and for inviting me, and all of you for organizing this event. It's a pity I cannot be in Florence in person. I was looking forward to, but what can we do? We have to work in the conditions that we have at the moment. I just want to make few points, and then, you know, looking forward to the discussion. I think this book developed out of obviously my previous work of nationalism, but what I was really puzzled by is kind of this dominance of particular interpretation of nationalism that has been around largely since 1980s, really, when we have all the foundational books on nationalism, Gellner and Anderson and Hobsbawm and others. And these books were really extremely important in shifting our understanding of nationalism, emphasizing modernity and emphasizing kind of this contingent character of nationalism as a phenomenon. But there are two problems really that I see with these perspectives, which haven't been addressed, which require addressing, and I try to do that to some extent in this book, in some of my previous books. First is this kind of idea that nationalism emerges suddenly. It's a kind of sort of revolutionary take on nationalism. It's something that emerges in French and American Revolution, and, you know, and suddenly spreads. And so it is kind of a Deus ex machina type of take on nationalism. So what I try to argue is that we have to kind of look a little bit more at the past. So that's why the longue durée approach is really important, but not in a sense how it has been done by Smith and Hutchinson and others that focuses on cultural continuity and kind of myths and memories. And it is essentially still very ethnicist interpretation. So I argue that the past matters, but what matters is really the organizational capacity, you know, that we build on the world that has already been there. And that's the thing, you know, with the importance of state, you know, the formation that state has taken throughout the centuries, and, you know, in the last 5,000 years, and particularly we look at empires, we look at the patrimonial kingdoms, we look at the city-states. So there is an element of continuity here, organizational continuity, on which nation states emerge. So we have to look at this kind of coercive capacity of these entities to say something about nation states, because some of this, what we have today, has been inherited from the past formations, but some of it is obviously very different. That's why in some of the chapters I particularly look at the empires and the kind of later stages of empire, the kind of 19th century empires like British and French. They were imperial states abroad, but they were also nationalizing states at home. So these are mutually constitutive processes, and that's why we have to look at these kind of organizational capacities. But we also have to look at the way how ideological penetration has expanded, because it had relied on the organizational capacity, and also the way how states have managed to penetrate society in the kind of everyday life, in the micro interactional context. So that's why, that's one element. You know, we have to move away from these kind of very either-or approaches where past doesn't really matter. Gellner is very explicit about this in his book. You know, past doesn't matter really. What matters is French Revolution and onwards. So that's one point. Second point, which is perhaps even more important, and that's the, you know, a lot of these theories have emphasized modernity of nationalism, and now we take that for almost for granted. But what they don't emphasize is that, you know, modernity itself is nationalist. So it's not just that nationalism is modern, it is that modernity is nationalist. And that's what we need to explain. Why is modernity nationalist? Why is nationalism all over us? You know, it's not just something that suddenly appears and then disappears. We have to explain this. So we need kind of proper analysis of this process. And I try to start this discussion in some respects. And when we look at the classical modernists, Gellner and Hobsbawm in particular, they're very kind of clear that they think that nationalism will disappear. You know, it is kind of something that is not, it's an element of modernization. And once you reach a certain degree of modernity, there is no need for nationalism anymore. But that hasn't been the case. What we have witnessed is really strengthening of nationalism, grounding of nationalism in its institutions, in everyday discourses, in ideology, and things like that. So nationalism is not a temporary transitional phenomenon as they assume it would be. It is a phenomenon that has really started in the 19th century and has gained influence in the 20th century, and it's much stronger today than it ever was. So it's not a relic of the 19th century. So what I try to do, I try to look at these kind of 4 different processes, which I call historical grounding, which essentially locates the development of nationalism and transformation of nationalism through time and space. So we're looking at the way how nationalism started off as a kind of minority pursuit, you know, intellectuals and cultural elites, and then political elites, economic elites, and then kind of gradually incorporated different social strata, in the middle classes, and then eventually everybody. So people have become ultimately all nationalized. Now we live in states that where everybody is fully nationalized to some degree. And nationalism is also plastic, so it was able to shift from left to right and accommodate different social groups, and it has changed historically. So it has become grounded both historically and horizontally, across class, across different social groups, and globally. It incorporates the whole world in some respects. Second process that I look at is organizational grounding, which is very important because nationalism could not expand and proliferate without organizational shells, some vehicles through which it gained influence. So initially, we're looking here at the specific small groups, revolutionary secret societies, then social movements that expand, then the state. Ultimately, the state is most important. The state is the vehicle of reproduction through educational system, through mass media, through military, police, courts, through everything what the state possesses. Then also civil society. Civil society is particularly important. Religious institutions, private corporations, NGOs, sports associations, all of these reproduce nation-centric understandings of reality. And we have to look at kind of power of these organizations and how their organizational capacity increases, nationalism increases as well. But then the third process that I look at is ideological grounding. And here we look at the content of ideas that nationalism exposes, or different forms of nationalism. So nationalisms offer these grand utopian vistas of collective liberation, emancipation, belonging, starting in some respect with the French Revolution, equality, liberty, and fraternity, particularly emphasis on fraternity, but also we see that in Romanticism and many other ideological movements that developed since. So we have the language of righteousness and morality, emotional attachments, all of these things are present within the ideological message, which is very much imposed through organizational grounding. So the two are linked very much. And then the fourth process that I look at is this micro-interactional grounding, which is essentially the way how nationalism operates in everyday life, in face-to-face interaction, how it links with the organizational ideological grounding, how the sense of attachment that we have with people that are our friends, our family, our neighbors, and is linked in these kind of, it's couched in the language of nationalism, nation centricity, and how this is reinforced by these all different institutions and organizations, that are around us. And nationalism is very powerful precisely when it's so embedded. So that's the whole point of grounding. It's in its almost invisibility. It becomes naturalized, normalized, taken for granted. Which indicates its power. And ideologies are very powerful, as we know from Bourdieu and others. They're most powerful when they're least visible. That's how patriarchy was, let's say, until 1950s. It was taken as given. It wasn't seen as an ideology. Now we question it because we are outside of it to some extent. So that's what I try to do. And I look at different case studies. I look mostly on the experiences of the Balkans in the 19th century, early 20th century, and contemporary kind of period, 21st century. I look at Irish society and Irish nationalism. I look at the role of different empires, British, Ottoman, Habsburg. I look at lots of other smaller cases, but much of my focus has been really on these two case studies. So I'll stop here now and give opportunity to others. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So, Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Siniša. Thank you very much. This is a great book that can surely be enjoyed across disciplines. It's a dense manifestation of an intellectual pursuit we can aspire to. So, as a political scientist, I had much to learn from it. It also gave me much to think about, not least because it challenged my biases on what we take for granted in my line of research, where we usually employ agency and rational choice as main organizational principles of our world. So my first comment derives from this underlying philosophical difference. You claim that, pulling out the notes, the rise and fall of nationalism is rarely dependent on the actions of determined elites or charismatic leaders, but largely on the workings of long-term structural forces. Now, I know this may take us in long debates on structure versus agents, but more on point, I have trouble integrating your view on nationalism as a historical embedded process that marches forward without any possibility to escape it, with the fact that its existence is enabled by the state, by the political elites who administer the state. So once you use phrases filled with action verbs, such as state authorities have utilized the nation state's organizational powers to forge more uniform and standardized institutions that would help mold their citizens into a relatively homogeneous population, end quote, I find it hard to track the consistency of completely separating actions of determined elites from structural forces. I mean, as long as we are on an agreed territory of constructive collective identities. So in political science, we try more and more to explain the rise of nationalism, or what you call new nationalism in your book, by reconciling the demand side at the population level and the supply side at the level of authorities within context. So it's a hard process, and we are failing most of the time by supplying much more simpler explanation than our world requires. But I wonder how committed you are to making this separation between structure and agency, since reading the book revealed to me a much deeper complexity than a straightforward argument that nationalism is the dominant form of human subjectivity in the modern world. So I'm making this theoretical point because I want to raise a more important question on what is the point of equilibrium, if such a point even exists, between liberal democracies and nationalism. And we touched upon it in our previous encounter. So the romantic state could easily identify itself with being the result of the will of the folk, of a primordial consciousness, a transcendent immaterial entity of a general will on some Wagnerian soundtrack. But the modern liberal state has to exist with much less mystical travesties. So it could be argued that the principles of liberal democracies that allow multiple identities and layered commitments are seriously challenged by the nationalist necessities to commit to exclusionary characteristics. I find here very convincing the argument of the philosopher Kwame Appiah, who says, channeling historian Ernest Renan in his daily plebiscite synthesis, that the liberal state is more about the willingness of the people to opt in on this togetherness that defines it. And it's not just an automatic response to the general will that it cannot be contested. So if nationalism is not built by self-interested elites and self-interested citizens that make up a population, if nationalism is not an end goal of some nationalist actors, then it's just a historical self-regulating system that ruthlessly feeds on individuals, constantly flirting with authoritarianism. So this book tells a wonderful story of how nationalism is compatible with globalism or capitalism, but underneath it all, this is the darker story that struck me. So I keep wondering, why do we frame a research question about these concepts, these isms, and the interaction between them as a sort of an end in themselves, when all they are creations that are supposed to cater to each individual's well-being? So in other words, what is the objective worth of nationalism? Once as a citizen, I ask not what I can do for my designated nation state, but what the nation state can do for me. So would such a question terminate or break this dark equilibrium that you point to? These are the kind of questions your book brought to my mind. So I believe the volume does much more than you announce in the introduction. Perhaps this was your intent. You set up your puzzle almost too humbly before you break into a crescendo of relevance. In your words, the main purpose of the book is to show that nationalism remains the most potent operative ideological discourse in the modern era. I do not see why that is a controversial viewpoint. Indeed, nations are the new tribes, right? Borrowing from Hannah Arendt's notion of tribal nationalism that she used to classify who fits into the category of us and who belongs to them. The more amazing question that your book raises is whether to the extent we are still committed to liberal democracy as the smallest of evil, is the nation part in the nation state our friend or our foe? But for that conversation, we need to bring back agency, and along with it, individual responsibility. So lastly, and it's my final point, I know you'll disagree because we talked about this earlier, but your book actually gave me a new understanding on the flaws in European integration process and why it should work as long as we want it to work. Because studying the formation of the nation state gives us the recipe. You give us the recipe. Much like the nation state, Europe is not a natural product. It exists through action and not by default. So if we draw a parallel between Europeanism and European Union and nationalism X and the nation state X, we can't not see similarities. European citizenship is a political construct. So following the recipe you propose, what decision makers need to do is sell the EU product more aptly, right? Because that also means engaging in a continuous strategic communication with European citizens. So this circles back to your argument about the micro interactions. And you are absolutely right that we have to bring long historical process and facts into play, which political scientists do not excel at. But the fact that we are all Europeans before we became Spanish or Czechs may not be a tough case to make. Europe has always been there in some sense, even if the institutions of Europe are more recent. So I think pro-Europeans should take a page from the nationalist playbook and narrate the story of Europe more convincingly. So to conclude, although this book is about nationalism, it's also about building programmatic meaning required for the success of pragmatically crafted institutions. I gave the example of Europe, but perhaps someone more ambitious could think beyond to global structures as you do in your book. So thank you very much for sharing your work and your thoughts with us, Siniša. I got excited as I went through this because in the end it's the big leagues of concepts that affect our lives, nationalism. And even if your points are mostly about the everyday, harmless, vanilla type of nationalism, it still reads like a good start in a bad direction.
Thanks a lot, Veronica. Jelena, you are next.
Thank you very much, Doro, and thanks for essentially inviting me to discuss Sinisha's book. And I was happy when I got the invitation, not only in view of my work on the Western Balkans, but also because quite a lot of the work that we do at Global Set Observatory is related to the processes of state and nation building, or the questions who the people are, which is at the center of all citizenship debates. And when Dorothee first mentioned this roundtable to me, I was quite happy and excited because I have known Sinisha's work since the 2000s, and it was incredibly useful for my own doctoral dissertation, which was on the conceptions of statehood and nationhood in Montenegro. But I'll come back to this. And I had really hoped that we would have the occasion to meet in person. But then again, I guess that this is as far as it will go for some foreseeable future. Now, to come back to the book, I'm actually delighted to see a book like Grounded Nationalisms to come into being. It is a very comprehensive volume, which I believe every scholar of nationalism will have on their bookshelf. And it is possibly as a result of being so grounded, to borrow Malešević's expression, a book that is incredibly difficult to criticize. So I actually struggled here to find what to say and to come up with some ideas that could be further discussed, or that will essentially help us to raise some further discussion on the questions that Siniša has addressed in his book. So the questions that I've come up with many of which will mostly come out of my personal interest in the questions related to nationalism. But I also hope to, in a way, try and perhaps push everyone here who's interested in the workings of nationalism from different perspectives to think about something like new research avenues in how to study this important notion. So this is where my first question to Siniša, or a comment actually, comes from. There's an incredibly beautiful definition of nationalism on page 8. I paraphrase it here because it would be difficult to turn on the screen now. Which defines nationalism as historically shaped and constantly changing phenomenon defined by its A, organizational capacity, B, aptitude to articulate ideologies and narratives, C, links wider ideologies and projects with broader moral and emotional universes. So I think that this is a beautifully written and a very concrete definition, which in my view has a bit of a problem that I think Veronica also tangentially touched upon. It gives nationalism agency. So in a way, when I read this approach to nationalism, I had the impression that it could somehow create and transform itself, which then for me raised the question, so is it really a phenomenon which I conceive of as an observable fact, or can we still think of nationalism in different ways and from different angles? So here you probably, Siniša probably will remember the writings from the 1990s, which criticized the singular approach to nationalism. And I think Lowell Barrington differentiated between nationalism as an idea, as a process, and as a movement, and looked at how all of these, as all of these three layers, if you wish, of nationalism get created and how they evolve. So in other words, my very simple question to Siniša is, what is nationalism? So just to put it simply in that way. Now, my second question probably comes out of my interest in studying nationalism in the Western Balkans, and it's very much related to something that you've also mentioned during your speech today, to this idea that you wanted to challenge the fact that nationalism emerges suddenly. And I very much agree with the fact that nationalism, in a way, needs an organizational structure. It thrives on it, essentially. But if I think of contemporary nationalisms, to me, they look very much different from nationalisms in the 19th century. So these are these new nationalisms, if you wish. So I was wondering, to what extent do these organizational structures replicate, or in a way, how do they replicate these new forms of nationalisms? What would be the mechanics of it? So that would be the second question. And the third one is, can we think of nationalism as political but not ideological? And here, this is very specific to my research, previous research on nationalism in Montenegro, which you know very well and you have written on. But here I'm thinking specifically about Erin Jenne and Florian Bieber's conception of situational nationalism, which I think perhaps is something to consider when possibly juxtaposing these processes of let's say, ideological nationalism, which can be a sort of a longue durée and very much grounded, and this situational / political nationalism, which emerges perhaps as a result of a particular political movement or elites, political elites, institutional or political objectives in a certain moment. So I think I will leave it at, yes, and I have one more point before concluding, and that would be, in a way, I was thinking of whether nationalism can be, in a way, also viewed from a gendered perspective. And there, what came to my mind is the imagery of nationalism, these ideologies that underpin the movement, right? And the immediate juxtaposition that came to my mind was the idea of the fatherland versus the motherland. And I think that especially for Eastern European societies, this in a way, feminist angle would in a way be important to look at as well. So I think I will leave it at that. I hope that my comments will inspire some discussion also among the participants here. And I would like to finish this speech by thanking Siniša for having written this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. Now we have Ben.
Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be joining this panel today and to have the opportunity to comment on Siniša Malešević's very thought-provoking book, Grounded Nationalisms. This book offers a sweeping appraisal of sociological work on the nature of nationalism, particularly in Europe, and it seeks to weigh in on a number of long-standing debates, especially surrounding the relationship of nationalism to modernity. Although Malešević describes himself as charting a path between the work of theorists who see nationalism and modernism as fundamentally linked on one hand, and those who have argued that nation states and nationalism hold deeper roots in long-standing ethnic and religious traditions on the other, he comes down more or less on the modernist side. He sees a link not only between modernity and nationalism, but goes even farther to suggest that modernity without nationalism is unthinkable, and that nationalism may be the single most influential ideology worldwide in the modern era. Malešević describes his view of modernist nationalism as grounded, which, as we've all already heard, means that modern nationalisms are thick ideologies because they have developed over a long historical time span, have been entrenched by elites and by state power, are then diffused as ideologies among middle classes, and finally become widespread at all levels of national societies, sustained by everyday forms of solidarity, articulation, and social reproduction. This is a telling that emphasizes the role of states and ideologies in the production of nationalism. And I find Malešević's description of the ubiquity of nationalism today, but also its spotty, relatively late, and somewhat tortured arrival to be broadly persuasive. I agree that nation thinking has become a major way of self-definition for millions or billions of people worldwide, internalized in ways similar to other identity characteristics such as gender and race. Like gender and race, nationalist identities can clearly be constructed in ways that are compatible with things like empire, capitalism, and globalization, as Malešević persuasively shows throughout the book. In my comments, I'd like to introduce a conceptual distinction that is not used in grounded nationalisms, but that may be useful for prying open some of the rich, complex analysis in the book. Specifically, I'd like to ask about the possibility of distinguishing between nationalism and nations, leaving states out of it for the moment. I think it might be interesting to probe the differences between these two things in order to test some of the aspects of Malešević's sociological model. My thinking about the distinction about this distinction has been shaped by a challenging book by Helmut Walser-Smith, Germany, A Nation in Its Time, which appeared this year. In this new book, Smith treats the history of modern Germany in three temporal epochs, what he calls before, during, and after nationalism. The premise of Smith's study is that a German nation existed independently from nationalism, and that both of these things have existed separately from the various forms that German states, including nation states, have taken over the past 5 centuries. I've been mulling over Smith's work for several months, and while reading Grounded Nationalisms, I tried to bring it into conversation with Malešević's somewhat different formulation. Perhaps the most useful point of entry, or better said, divergence between these ways of conceptualizing nation thinking might be the issue of violence, a topic that Malešević knows very intimately. In Grounded Nationalisms, he writes against the notion that recent upswellings of right-wing nationalism, such as Brexit or the election of Donald Trump, are somehow new phenomena that represent truer forms of nationalism than identities that were previously present. Malešević writes that nationalism is in fact most entrenched when it is not openly combative or extreme, such as in Scandinavian liberal democracies. He tells us that nationalism is not inherently violent, and he ends his book with the following quotation: "Although the noisy, barking nationalisms usually receive more attention, it is the tranquil, biting nationalisms that really matter." Coming from the tradition of German history, I'm of course intrigued by theories of radical nationalism and the extent to which they are or are not considered aberrational. I wonder if disaggregating nations from nationalism might allow events like Brexit or Trump's election to fit more smoothly into Malešević's overall model. They're clearly related, but I wonder, are they the same thing? If nationalist logics historically begin at the level of the state and of elite culture, and then filter down through social structures until they become mundane, shouldn't barking nationalisms become less common over time within societies like Britain or the United States with highly nationalized cultures? To take another example, Germans today often hold very strong sensibilities of being German, but are they truly more nationalist than the Nazis? I certainly agree with Malešević that we should devote attention to the power of apparently tranquil nations, the dogs that bite, as he puts it. But I also wonder if the grounding that makes these states so potentially dangerous is a combination of biting nation thinking and barking nationalism. Grounded Nationalisms is especially focused on the formation of what I am here calling nations. And I wonder if that emphasis might itself somewhat limit the potential reach of Malešević's insights by keeping them locked in a certain kind of methodological nationalism. That is, the idea that nations or nationalisms are best studied on their own terms rather than transnationally. Malešević certainly takes a comparative and at times global approach. Focusing on the production of nations, however, may also obscure the extent to which nationalism has hardly been consistent in kind across history or across global space. In describing nationalism's spread beyond its European cradle, Malešević writes that it, quote, was gradually embraced by populations all over the globe, unquote. The impression here is of a fundamentally similar type of nationalism being reproduced in new locations. In a chapter on globalization, Malešević expands. Once generated, he writes, nationalism tends to proliferate around the world as its ideological appeal helps provide a wide-ranging popular justification for a variety of government actions. He continues, as globalization spreads, so does the nationalist message. The latecomers tend to imitate the dominant nation-centric models of economic and political growth. It seems to me that Malešević is referring here to populations in the global south, particularly Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it occurs to me to ask, what does it mean to refer to these countries as latecomers? Are they late because they have been slow to notice some teleological quality of modernity that defines social progress and value by historical time? To put my question differently, I wonder if collapsing nationalism and nations into one phenomenon may make it difficult to see how the proliferation of nation thinking produced a deeply unequal global state system, even as the spread of nationalist thought worldwide helped to obscure this material reality. The centrality of white supremacy to nationalism's rise and global spread seems to me a crucial further ingredient that might be added to our discussion. That modern nationalism first emerged most strongly in Europe and in white settler states appears as a given in Malešević's book. That this occurred in the context of European global expansion, imperial rule, and the enslavement of peoples of color might be relevant for ongoing discussions about why European societies built nationalist models at home, even as they erected increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for exploiting and expropriating others abroad. The adoption and reformulation of nationalism by anti-colonial activists as a means of throwing off imperial systems, especially during the 20th century, might also have helped to explain the diffusion of nation states and their entrenchment as a global norm. It may further be worth asking why, when the United States emerged as a global hegemon 70 years ago, it presided over the construction of a world system in which the nation state became the fundamental unit of international political order. To return to my original point of departure, it seems to me that Brexit and Trump's election were not major deviations from strands of nation building that created a world of ostensibly similar nation states over which the West exercises disproportionate power. These events might also be seen as moments in debates about British or American nationalism related to the question, who benefits from state power? I'm thinking here about the work of Black radical authors who have always known that nationalism as an ideology can function to make empires look like nation states, obscuring how even the most liberal political systems can function as democracies for some people, but as fascist police states for others. The perpetual state-sponsored killing of Black and brown people, as well as the industrial-scale warehousing of people of color in my own country, the United States, are examples that strike close to home for me. Similar phenomena can also be found in the European liberal democracies that for Malešević represent the strongest forms of nationalism. One thinks of Europe's dreadful response to the migrants coming from Africa and the Middle East, but Europe's liberal democracies might also be considered dangerous because of the groundedness of their nationhoods, the everyday political consensuses that allow states like France and Germany to export a tremendous volume of arms, or the basic unfairness of our global capitalist system that keeps Europe rich at the expense of formerly colonized countries across the global South. Malešević is undoubtedly correct to identify nationalism as a profoundly widespread phenomenon. I wonder if his insight might be even richer than he thinks. Could it be useful to talk not only about the groundedness of nationalism, but also the groundedness of nations? It seems to me worth asking whether studying the relationships and interactions between these two aspects of modernity and global state formation might yield opportunities to more deeply understand the nature of our complex world. I'm grateful to Malešević for authoring such a stimulating book. It has given me a tremendous amount to ponder and new directions for my own research, and I look forward very much to the rest of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hanspeter, floor is yours.
Siniša, if I may, I'm the odd man out here because I'm a new member of your fan club. I had to read your book as a member of the Stein-Rocken Prize Committee, and I was immediately impressed by the book, I must say, because you allow a fresh look at the well-worn subject. And in each chapter, you make highly original and rich insights, as far as I'm concerned. And every chapter is undermining some well-worn views on nations and nationalism, based on examples which I was quite unfamiliar with, like Ireland and the Balkans. Now, in my comments, I will be a bit more specific than my predecessors. I want to raise 3 pairs of questions for 3 chapters. Chapter 7, Chapter 9, and Chapter 10. Chapter 7 was for me very interesting because it tackles the bellicist thesis, which claims that wars make states and states make war. And I was always a fan of Charles Tilly and his thesis about how states were a byproduct of Western European war making from the 16th century onward. Now, you say that for this thesis, the Balkan case remains something of a puzzle, since for much of history, the Balkans didn't make war. Actually, once the Ottoman Empire had conquered the region, it was successfully pacified for centuries. And moreover, the most important state buildup in the Balkans in the second half of the 19th century, early 20th century, occurred during periods of extended peace. While the Balkan Wars, which we all know, and the First World War actually did not contribute to state building in the Balkans. So here come my two questions about this. Do we have to revise the Belicist argument because it is unable to explain the persistent weakness of nationalism in the 19th and early 20th century Balkans? Or do we have to modify the scope of the argument? Do we have to say that it just doesn't apply to this part of Europe, which would be natural because this part of Europe didn't participate in the scramble for state building because it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire? Is it as simple as that? Then my second question is, you do not discuss the experience of World War II for the development of nationalism in the Balkans. You insist on an earlier period, and later on you will say in the chapter 9 that actually nations came late to the Balkans and they came in the post-World War II period. So what about the World War II? I mean, I'm not familiar with the history of the Balkans in World War II so much, but I know about Ustasha, Chetniks, and partisans. So what was their contribution to state building in the Balkans? My second pair of questions turns on your chapter 9, where you discuss contemporary nationalism in Serbia and Croatia. And you say that in these societies it has become grounded only in the more recent past. And you argue that in the 20th century, nationalism exerts a much firmer grip on society than was the case in its 19th century equivalent. Nationalism has become much more grounded, as you explained in your introduction, also in Serbia and Croatia. And you point to a number of organizational structures like educational systems, like which socialize pupils into nation-centered views. You mentioned the standardized versions of national language, you mentioned common high culture, you mentioned the highly centralized polities with enormous public sectors, extensive communication and transportation systems, which provide the infrastructure, the nationalist infrastructure. So today's Serbs and Croats are completely familiar with the nationalist tropes, while the peasants in the 19th century had to be told who they were. Now, my puzzle about this story, which I find a very nice story, but why did the nationalism develop as a Croat and a Serb nationalism? Before there were Serbia and Croatia, there was Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was a very powerful nation state by 19th century standards. So it was a post-war nation state that had all this organizational capacity and infrastructure. Why did it not succeed to create a permanent nationalism? Why did the nationalisms become Croatian and Serbian? And another question, how important is this prestige-driven nationalism of the 20th and 21st century for individual countries? Is it maybe not precisely the fact that nationalism was a latecomer to the Balkans that it explains why it is still so important for the countries in the region, while it might not be that important anymore in other countries? And this brings me to your last chapter, which I thought was particularly interesting, the chapter on globalization. You attempt to show how globalization, nationalism, and modern subjectivities have historically constituted each other. You argue that the nation state still remains the most powerful and only legitimate model of territorial rule. Since nationalism is sustained by organizational, ideological, and micro-interactional infrastructures of the nation state, it remains the dominant operative ideology and the principle, the mode to legitimate rule in modernity. By contrast, cosmopolitanism largely lacks organizational ideological basis, remains a minority elite product. For you, it is important to recognize that globalization is only possible on the back of very powerful nation states. Now, my two questions here are the following. First, as you argue, also, nationalism moved from an elite ideology to everybody's ideology. So, as nationalism, it might happen for cosmopolitanism, which might move from an elite project, an elite ideology, to everybody's ideology. We currently witnessed the spectacle of the presidential elections in the United States with an ideological divide between rural and urban areas. In the US, the countryside is red, the cities are blue. The cities are the driving force of modern society. They become ever more cosmopolitan, while the countryside, it is the countryside that remains not so much touched by the current modernization process and remains tied to the nationalist ideology. I liked your examples from sports very much. And I give you an example from sports which illustrates the point I want to make. What is the most important soccer championship in Europe? It's not the European Championship of national teams. It's the Champions League. That is, it is a competition between city teams, not national teams. Moreover, the players of these teams come from all over the place. So these are not nationally composed teams. I ask you, where does the most famous or one of the most famous Croatian professional players play nowadays? He plays with the FC Barcelona. And where was he born? He was born in Rheinfelden in Switzerland, which I happen to know because I'm a Swiss, and the beginning of his career was in Switzerland. My second question is actually the same question as Veronica's. You say nationalism is the only legitimate mode of rule nowadays. She asked you, nationalism and democracy, friend or foe? Nation and democracy, friend or foe? And I would like to ask the same thing. Democracy, I mean, I always thought the only legitimate justification of rule nowadays was democracy, and have never thought that it could be nationalism. Of course, historically, the two developed in very close interaction. As Laia Greenfeld once said, the one was the chrysalid for the butterfly that came out, yeah, something like that. That was it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I cannot prevent myself from saying, if Hanspeter doesn't find a Swiss connection, you know that he doesn't appreciate your work. But clearly there is a Swiss connection even to of course to nationalism, but also to the world of soccer and Croatian players. So Siniša, you have your hand full now. It's up to you. You choose what you would like to address and what not. And how, I mean, yeah, not too long, but you have the floor. You have a lot to digest, but I guess it's also a sign of a really productive and very, very interesting contributions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you all four of you. I mean, I have 2 pages now of various questions and comments. I think it's about 18 questions that I should address, which probably would take me 3 hours at least. So it's impossible for me to do this now. So I'll try to be as brief as possible and cover as much as possible. I think all comments were really very good, very useful, and I don't know if I can. I'll see if I can answer them as quickly as I can. So Veronica very, very engaging, very eloquent, and I think I agree with many points that you made. We do disagree probably around the Europe. In a sense, the point, I'll pick up your last point about kind of whether Europeanization can be built along the same lines of the way how nation states were built. And I think it's too late for that in some respect, because you already have nationalized populations. You have, people who have been socialized, for a number of generations in a particular mode of thinking of themselves first and foremost as being members of distinct nation states. And if you look at the surveys, Eurobarometer surveys, over the last 40 years, you see continuous increase in the number of people identifying strongly or very strongly with their nation states. We obviously have educational systems which are nation-centric. There is no pan-European one. Mass media, although there is a global media, it portrays certain messages in distinct way. Even these very global media tend to be very nationally focused. Police, military, intelligence services, all of these things are very much nation-centric. Public sphere, predominantly nation-centric. So in that sense, it's too late to try to do that. But there is also a problem. We talked about this previously, that European Union was never really envisaged as something that would replace nation states, and so it is more like to balance them rather than to replace them. And I think that worked well up to now. I mean, there are constant crises, but it's there's this an extra layer of protection which kind of keeps us safe to some extent, which others don't have. So I think for the European Union, it's better not to be like a nation state. The second point, the first point that you made about agency and structure, yeah, I mean, I maybe that quote that you picked overemphasized a little bit more structural aspects of nation formation. But I try to be specific of, I say the importance of agency. That's the whole thing about the micro international grounding. It is all about conscious thinking, reflective agents who engage on everyday level, but also on elite level. I mean, political elites are important, but they change. I mean, you can remove them and the states are still there. There will always be somebody in government. And that's the nature of nationalism, is being really profoundly plastic. You might get people who are far right, you might get people who are center, you get people who are left wing. Eventually, when you become part of the state, you are inevitably moving in a particular direction and using discourses of nationhood. And now today we can see, Trump's version of kind of this ethnicist nationalism and racist nationalism versus Biden's more kind of traditional American nationalism. But it's a nationalism nonetheless. I mean, it's the same speech. If you look at Biden's speech, it's exactly, we the nation, we are the best when we're united, and all of that. That's a typical, most leaders will do that. Even if they might be in a position, far left and be against any kind of nationalism, once they're in power, they have to embrace this discourse, because this is the discourse of the state that has been reproduced. In a sense, agency does matter, but it's this kind of this track, institutional track, organizational track that has been there, is already set up. So it's not easy to change it, to undermine it. I don't know what was the next. Yeah, we talked, I mean, this is the point that Hanspeter has raised as well with liberal democracy and nationalism. And I think Hanspeter mentioned that, and that's the point here, that both of them have been, they were born together. Liberal democracy and nationalism are born together. This is, if you look at the French, Republic, what is it? We the people, meaning the French, and the French is conceptualized both as demos and this kind of homogenized, entity. So you cannot be Breton, you cannot be Corsican, you have to be French. So we'll kill off your difference, and that's the nature of nationalism. Nationalism has been a coercive phenomenon, and liberal democracy came very much through violence, the experience of violence, wars of revolutionary wars and Napoleonic wars, and so now we live in a world, particularly in a kind of EU context, where we don't see that kind of legacy, but the legacy is a violent legacy. Michael Mann's book, The Dark Side of Democracy, is really good in that respect, because he makes that link very clearly and looks at lots of different cases. Jelena, yeah, I mean, it's raised lots of issues here. What is nationalism? I do kind of try to look at nationalism as an ideology that posits nation as a principal unit of human solidarity and political legitimacy. But I also say it's more than that. You know, it's also a meta ideology, because it incorporates so many different things and can work in so many different ways. And that's why it's not just an ideology. It is also a state project. It's also linked with civil society and social movements. All of these things that are there. I don't know if it came across that you know, I attribute Asians to nationalism. That wasn't my intention. In a sense, maybe that particular sentence wasn't formulated as fluently as it should be. I do kind of make clear in all of my books that, you know, I have a constructivist understanding of all of these processes, but sometimes it's not easy to express yourself without, you know, sounding as if you're attributing agency. I'm not, that was not my intention. In terms of differences between 19th century and 21st century nationalism, yes, I mean, that's my point in a way. And I think the chapter on Croatia and Serbia, and this is a little bit answer to Hanspeter as well, tries to show this kind of, you know, nationalism changes. And my argument is that it's stronger now in contrast to conventional historical understanding of nationalism as a 19th century phenomenon. It isn't. It started off as an elite project, and it didn't affect most people then. I mean, the histories that we've learned until recently were themselves nationalist histories, because they projected, so, oh, this is when our nation was finally united, Italy and Germany and blah, blah, blah. But in reality, this is a 20th, 21st century when majority of people are nationalized in that sense. So there are differences, and I think it's important to look at these differences. And nationalism is multifaceted phenomenon. It appears in so many different guises. And I think the point that you're making about the situational nationalism, I would say that all nationalisms are situational in a sense. So you can look at the contingent factors that motivate some actors to behave in a certain way, but it is an interesting trajectory. And Montenegro is a wonderful example. I don't have time to go into that, and you know that much better than me, you know, of how, you know, political elites could switch their political identities completely because of, in some respects, I mean, it is beneficial to them, you know, as situational nationalism would argue, but it's also the structural pull. You know, there is this legacy of Montenegranness, Montenegrin state, and you're building separate institutions, and that in itself pushes you in direction of building kind of distinct nationalism. Belarus is another interesting example of, you know, initially very weak nationalism, very much aligned to Russia, and a lot of legitimacy of the profoundly illegitimate ruler, the dictator, was built on that thing. You know, we'll rejoin Russia in some respect. But then even he had to switch more towards Russian nationalism, because there's this pool of organizational capacities and ideologies. People are more nationalized. But now the next Belarusian, democratic Belarus will be nationalist in that sense. There will be no, you know, and that's okay. So I'll just jump further to Ben. Thanks, Ben, very much. I enjoyed kind of your link with kind of historical things in Germany, you know, all this, you know, very, very interesting, eloquent, and I have to read Smith's book, which I haven't read. I'm not, I mean, I don't like to use the term nations. I know what you mean, but for me, nation is very difficult to define. I prefer to state is a it's a very, very hard to pin down what is a nation. And I'm very clear that I don't define that. I mean, I don't define in any of my books what nation is, because it's, I don't think you can define. That's why I use the term nation state, because it is a, you know, something that it's not a reality, because, you know, some people think that this means that, you know, nation and states are one, which they are not. Obviously, all states are culturally homogeneous, but they are all that notion of homogenizing population. Even in the multicultural states, you get that pull, you know, we are Canadians, you know, we might be diverse, we might speak different languages, but we are Canadians, and we have to kind of find this common thread, which has some cultural, to use term nation state with this understanding that, you know, this is a flexible category, but it's a category I can trace. I can trace historically how it develops, how it changes. With nation, it's exists at some point or doesn't exist. This is very difficult to prove, because it changes as well, the perception. So that's why I try to keep it, separately and don't use it as and that might be linked to the methodological nationalism point that you're raising. Again, since I've criticized methodological nationalism for many years, because obviously there is no overlap between nation and society, and society is much wider, and transnational interactions matter and all of this. But majority of population in the world see themselves in these methodologically nationalist terms, and we have to take that as an object of study. So we have to separate methodological nationalism as a bad methodological practice from nationalism of everyday life, that people use these categories and see the world in these terms. Okay, so just a jump now to Hanspeter. I think you've raised like 6 questions. I think I can answer them all. The first thing about Tilly, yes, I mean I've written a few books on war and violence. I'm a great admirer of Tilly and Mann, and I've tried also to engage with the Belarus tradition from the 19th century and see what's there. So my ambition was not just dismiss Tilly altogether, just to see kind of what is missing here, and how we can reorganize that. And because you do have lots of cases, not necessarily Balkans. You can look at Costa Rica. Costa Rica never really had the military, and its most effective state in that part of the world. Didn't have wars, and so in a sense, you have these examples throughout the world where wars didn't necessarily generate a functional states. So it has to be kind of situated. It has to be a link to other things, and I linked it with the class position, with the kind of distinction between urban and rural population, and the lack of the urban classes, and all of these things. So I'm not against sort of Belarus tradition. I'm just sort of trying to be more reflexive of the way how it's used and expanding it a bit, I think, more. The Second World War, I have written a book on my first book deals really with the communist Yugoslavia and its legitimacy immediately after the Second World War. So I talk a little bit about this experience of the Second World War, and then compares it to Croatia and Serbia in the 90s and looks for similarities and differences. And in that respect, what's interesting, I mean, war period was obviously very bloody period, lots of killing, and you mentioned Ustašas and Chetniks and everything, but these states were essentially occupied. I mean, they were not independent, despite Croatian fascist puppet state claiming to be one. And this was a very short period for state building. So I don't think much has been achieved during that period. There's a lot of killing, a lot of fighting going on, and these wars were you could see them more as civil wars really than interstate wars. So they would fit Tilly's argument in that sense. The civil wars are destructive. Interstate wars historically have built better institutions. This is linked with your next point, why there was no Yugoslav nationalism in that sense. I think, Yugoslav nationalism is a big topic in itself. There was a Yugoslav nationalism, but it was very layered. It was layered and built on already existing nationalism. So, the Yugoslav communists tried to escape the problem that monarchist Yugoslavia had, which tried to kind of do the 19th century Piedmont style of let's build one nation, largely around the Serbian idea, but that didn't work. That failed, So Yugoslav partisans and communists in general were aware this cannot happen. So we have to build federal state. We have to accommodate already existing national elites. So that's the thing, you ended up with having these communist elites which themselves pursued nationalist discourses in a subtle way as a part of the kind of the brotherhood and unity and all of these kind of communist ideologies, and then gradually moved much more and more towards nationalism, which fits to many extents to what I'm arguing about, kind of organizational capacity and ideological penetration, why Yugoslav nationalism never really had a chance in many respects. I don't know now. I even forgot what was the. There were all these questions that I know.
The cosmopolitan.
Yes, the cosmopolitan. Yeah, that's the thing with the cosmopolitan. It doesn't really have institutions that are at the same level as the states are. You could say, okay, let's look at the soccer championship. That works in part because this is obviously a neoliberal project of private corporations running their own thing and attracting audiences and trying to kind of take ownership of the national idea of the teams, but teams still maintain that. You know, you have players from all over the world, but when they win something, they do bring their flags. And so, you know, I'm from Nigeria, I'm from Montenegro, and you know, even though I won this with Barcelona, or I won it with Real, and the teams are still perceived, even though people, you know, you have people supporting them from all over the world. Everybody knows these are the teams from these specific states. You know, and that's the thing, you know, how even football is packaged. So the notion of Brazilian football is very good. Brazilian thing matters. German football, it's German football. The national categories are still there.
I was maintaining that the city is also there. It's Barcelona, it's Real Madrid, it's Red Star Belgrade. So it's a city, and it's AC Milan. And the team is cosmopolitanly composed. It has players from all nations, and the nations are largely secondary. It's important that Messi plays for Barcelona. He's an Argentine, of course, everybody knows, but he plays for Barcelona.
But, you know, as you mentioned, everybody knows he's an Argentine. So you do know players where they are from. You know, these categories are still there. So I don't think that this will replace, you know, this might contribute to some, again, complexity of understanding the world, but we don't really have equivalent of nation states. And that's why I emphasize why nation states have still this hegemony, because, you know, we've removed these empires and city states and patrimonial kingdoms. And what we do have a kind of global institutions, but nobody has a territorial monopoly in that sense as nation states do. And that is the source of a lot of what we, you know, why nationalism still is what it is. Maybe I should stop here and then leave some of these questions that I had.
Thanks a lot. I mean, this was hugely inspiring and thought-provoking. So we have some time for questions from or comments from the audience, and also if any of the panelists want to come back on the answers. And whoever wants to talk, please do raise your blue hands. Okay, so I see one, Dejan Stepanovic. Could you, yeah.
Okay, well,
okay,
thank
perfect,
you. Yeah, thank you very much. Very exciting, and happy to see that Umotoskiriblis allergy of imagined communities of nationalism scholars doesn't really hold, but it's much more of an fiesole campanilismo at DUI. But jokes aside, actually, I had a serious question, which is about the organizational capacity for violence, you know, related to nationalism. So, Siniša, we kind of haven't had a chance to speak about it yet, but I'm teaching a module or giving a lecture on nationalism in a couple of weeks' time, and this is one of the topics. And I agree to a large extent with your explanation of that, you know, that the nation state has this organizational capacity for committing violence, and we have a lot of illustrations and a lot of cases of that. But how about some earlier history, such as Spanish conquest of South America and similar? And the question is here also more, not just, you know, factually, you can always find an exception, but if we are kind of replacing categories of analysis here, whether, you know, what are we speaking about? Is that nationalism only? Is it only about the state, or is it just about human society that is able, once it's organized in a particular way, to commit such acts of violence?
Okay, do you want to respond, Siniša? Or?
Will I take a few more questions, or will I respond?
Yes, maybe let's see whether we have other questions, or, as I said, also someone, let's collect a couple of things and then give Siniša the final word on this. So someone from the panel who still would like to. Okay, I mean, while I wait for other questions, I would I would still want to push you on this this question. I think that came up several times. So for you, nationalism seems to be really the end point. So to Veronica, you said, yeah, the European Union comes a little bit too late into the picture. You know, we see that nationalism is still around, but you always also say still. And to Hanspeter, you say, yeah, it's true with this Champion League. The fact is that, but we still know the nationality of the people. But I mean, thinking forward, right? Where do you, so in a way, I come back to the question that Veronica was asking. So given that it took also very long for nationalism to become that entrenched, it started somewhere. And in that sense, of course, I mean, the transnational organization of some new identity, be it cosmopolitan or whatever, might also start somewhere. So how would you study the process nowadays of basically at least tendencies of overcoming nationalism? Okay, meanwhile, let me see whether we have any other. No. So then I give you the final word, Siniša, and unless we have, no, I don't see any other person raising their hand.
Yeah. Okay, so first Dan's question on organizational capacity and violence. Yeah, I mean, obviously, since the foundation of first, pristine states about 10,000 years ago, violence was at the heart of state formation. So this is a process that has been around for a very long time, and states, this is go back to Tilly and Mann and others. States have been formed through the experience of war and later on revolutions and many other forms of organized violence. But what is distinct about nation states is they do kind of establish monopoly in the legitimate use of violence, and also, I would argue, taxation and legislation and education. And all of these things are crucial for kind of embedding this nationalism, making it grounded in that respect. So we had imperial powers, which and Dan mentioned the kind of Spanish empire colonizing the world, and Ben mentioned also the kind of legacies of colonialism. So in that sense, the coercive power was present, but nation states are different from empires in terms of being able to really, relying on technology and science and building better transport communication networks, were able to kind of co-opt society in that sense. So they rely on society. Organizational capacity comes from the fact that you're very much embedded in the nation states, which you were not in the context of early empires, particularly. Later empires are different because this is so in that sense they're more coercive, but they don't really need to rely on despotic power, as was the case, let's say, with empires. You could, today presidents want the prime ministers of liberal democracies. No, but you don't expect them to go and shoot people around as emperors were able to do. But states have much more infrastructural capacity in that sense of controlling people, taxing them at source, and finding ways to impose their will. Sometimes with consent and sometimes without consent. So in that sense, that's where the coercive power is present and increased. And when there is a resistance, as we see, let's say recently in the US, when people organize themselves around Black Lives Matter, then police it's visibly brutal. And that is police is always there. Coercive capacity is always there. It's only occasionally used. Okay, thanks. And Dora, a question for, you're right, there is an end point. In a sense, nationalism originated at some point and it will end at some point, as nation states will end at some point. I don't know when that will be. My view is that will take a long time unless we end up with environmental disaster and the planet ends much earlier than we are all hoping for. This is not inevitable. Not nation states are not the pinnacle of human life. Hopefully, it's not. It is interesting to understand whether these processes can unravel, and they can. So my point is not this is a kind of end of the everything and it's a pinnacle of human development. The point is that as long as these processes are in place, organizational capacity, reproduction of this kind of organizational grounding, ideological grounding, micro-directional grounding, then nationalism is there. And I mentioned more perhaps in my previous book on nationalism that, you know, for 99% of our existence of this planet, we lived as hunter-gatherers. So it's not natural for us to live in nation state. This is a very unnatural environment for human beings. You know, so it is really that we find ourselves chained in some respect in these organizational shells and ideological shells that keep reproducing themselves. And as they do, we see themselves in these national categories. They can collapse. We might end up with something much worse. We might end up with empires, or might end up as who knows what. But it could be something different, could be something better, could be something more cosmopolitan, but we still don't have institutions.
Then again, thank you all actually very, very much for a very inspiring, very rich, very broad debate on nationalism and the never-ending nationalism until, you know, something even more terrible comes along, or maybe also better comes along. With this, we conclude this part, the roundtable part, and I would suggest for those, it's only Max Weber Fellows and those who have signed up, who stay on for the behind the scene workshop, the brief session on behind the scenes. Let's take 10 minutes break so that we all have time to refresh ourselves a little bit and reconvene at 18:35 under the same link. And for the rest of you, I wish you a very nice evening and thank you all for a terrific panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.